And I think everybody knows the system, so if you put on the headphones, you'll hear it as clearer. Great. So welcome everybody. Welcome to this session on how new NDCs should deliver just energy transitions. My name is Shirley Matheson. I am the Global NDC Enhancement Coordinator for WWF. So I'm working with our offices around the world on issues to enhance their NDCs. WWF works on the NDCs we want. So we look and see what progress we want to see on NDCs over time. And we work across 3 different areas. So we work on energy, we work on nature, and we work on food systems. And core to our energy work is just transitions. Core to our work is discussing the role of the just transition, and we think this is very important for the NDC 3.0 discussion especially. So that's the session here, so welcome. I want to welcome our panelists as well. So we wanted to do I'll do a quick introduction to who's speaking, and then we'll move on to some questions. So joining us, maybe I go from right to left, we have Tanyeli Sabuncu. I hope I got that right. Joining us from WWF Turkey, he's our Climate and Energy Practice Manager, who has also been working across the network on just transition issues, and he's going to talk about some of our most recent work here. Absolutely delighted to welcome our colleague from ILO, Mustafa Kamal. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been really wonderful to have you here. He's here, the director of the Just Transition Program in ILO, so we'll talk to us about the role of workers and how we can unlock the just transition from the labor perspective. And we do have an online participant, Joachim Roth, which I'm not sure if we can see him yet. Is he going to pop up behind me? Oh, I see him in front of me. Hi, Joachim. Hi. Nice to see you. So Joachim is joining us from the World Benchmarking Alliance. He's the climate policy lead, and he's also been working with WWF as well as with our Alliance on Just Energy Transformation on just transition issues. So welcome, Joachim. Nice to have you here remotely. So what I'm going to do is maybe just a quick introduction, and then we'll go into questions for each of the panelists, and very welcome to have some questions at the end if there's anything that you would like us to cover. Talking about why we're here, I mean, we've talked about it before, that there is an urgency in reacting to the climate change crisis. Like I said, I work on NDCs, I work engaging on NDCs 3.0, so having a look to see what the narrative is and following what's the narrative since COP28 and the global stocktake. One of the things that we've really seen is that fossil fuel phase out, transitioning to renewable energies, it's so important. And we really need to do this. We most recently had the emission gap report, for example, which really talked about how critical this is. And there's a lot of discussion on how to do this, and it's because it's a very, very complex problem. It's a massive system that we need to shift. And as part of that, we need to think about how we do it in the right way. So this is why I think it's really important to have this discussion now, because NDCs 3.0 is really the last chance for us to get these pathways that are cost effective. And as part of that, we need to have a just transition embedded in that. So we work under a larger coalition called the Alliance for Just Energy Transformation, which is designed to contribute to this discussion. So convene some actors, including the Welsh Benchmarking Alliance, WWF, to pull together some of our work on this and really try and further the narrative. Just transition is one of those very interesting areas where everybody knows what just transition means when you say it, but in the same way that nationally determined contributions are nationally determined, just transition is a very nationally orientated dialogue. So that's another thing to take into account with these dynamics, and that's something that we've had to counter with as we think about what just transition looks like in NDCs 3.0. So I think we can go into some of the discussions around this. So maybe Tanyeli, if I start from you. Can you tell us a little bit why you think the just energy transition should be integrated into the NDCs 3.0, and what are the key elements?
Yeah, thank you very much, Shirley. Like you have mentioned, we're working on this issue under larger coalition, the Alliance for Just Energy Transformation. So maybe I can just start with talking a little bit of what is the Alliance for Just Energy Transformation and what it basically aims for and who does it include. AJET, with its short name, it's a multi-stakeholder voluntary initiative aiming at creating a common understanding and drive to transform the energy system. And it includes WWF, UNDP, and KPMG as the founding members. In addition to them, it includes Renewable Energy 21, AN Consulting, Environmental Defense Fund, Think Zero, and World Benchmarking Alliance as well. So it's a growing multi-stakeholder initiative. And under this, I'm sorry, I just need to get to my slides. Can we just move on to? So under this initiative, we have developed a working group, which included the members of AJET, including World Benchmarking Alliance and in consulting and different offices from the WWF network. So in this context, we work together to basically develop a common narrative on the NDCs and the just energy transition and the guidance in this context. So our purpose is basically to establish a foundation, providing a basis for integrating just energy transition frameworks into NDCs and initiate constructive discussions in this context. So, but before going into further detail in the content, it's better if I start with what do we mean by just energy transitions and just energy transformation. When we say just energy transitions, we are talking about the shift from fossil fuels to sustainable, sufficient, and efficient renewables based energy system, basically changing the energy system in the local context or national context to limit the global temperature, global warming at 1.5 degrees threshold, but while doing so, to ensure decent work and social protection and uphold labor rights. But and also guarantee the intergenerational and gender equity. But on the other hand, when we are talking about just energy transformation, we are talking about the global systemic change. So we can see as the energy transitions as local or national transitions, those are serving to a global systemic change in the energy system. So when we look at the current NDCs in a more broader context, we see that nearly 40% of the NDCs somehow refer to just transition, but not to just energy transition or just energy transformation in a more basically in a more sectoral context and where showing the transition is going to be. But more than that, the 40%, within those 40% of the NDCs, only a small amount of them actually include a chapter on this. So describing more in detail what it is perspective on just transition and what the measures are going to be. So why we should integrate just energy transition into NDCs? Well, we can just name 3 reasons. First, they unlock the ambition that we need. But in this context, it's very important to ensure inclusiveness and participation. Only by that way we can actually avoid any resistance in this context, because if you do not include people who are going to be directly affected by the change, then you cannot expect them to support it, right? On the other hand, we also need obviously meeting the Paris Agreement goals to ensure energy transition aligned with 1.5-degree goals, and also to ensure holistic planning. So obviously the role of the private sector is important. So when we have just energy transition elements in the NDCs, it's going to give a direct sign to the businesses to basically develop the necessary plans and to basically start the transition on the ground and to do their part. So when we are talking about when we are talking about integrating just energy transition, what sort of elements are we talking about? So we have 4 main components. Those are including assessments to evaluate the impacts on all society groups, and engagement on the other hand, which is key, as we say, to ensure inclusiveness, and on the other hand, institutional capacity and policy support, and finance as the 4th element. And on the other hand, another important set of components is the guiding principles of the Alliance for Just Energy Transformation, which you see on the right side of the screen. Being guided by the science, be fair, sustainable, ambitious, and consistent, and so on. So under those components, our discussion paper includes, basically discusses the main elements. Those can be part of the NDCs. Those can be elaborated while developing the NDCs. So under the assessments, we should have the tools to identify the benefits and potential and negative impacts. And on the other hand, the potential and negative impacts of the energy transitions taking place, because the current energy system caused many injustices and grievances on the ground. So we should not, to avoid repeating them again, to transition to another system, then we first have to measure the impacts. But on the other hand, we also have to do equity impact assessments for any new energy projects. Inclusive engagement, that is for sure a key element to ensure, in that case, a robust stakeholder engagement is very important. On the other hand, for the policy support, we see that the enabling policies and institutional arrangements are key. And for a financial mechanism, we need to have investment planning targeting energy poverty, and also incentives for private investment in renewable energy. In addition to the discussion paper, we have, or somehow my pointer is not working. In addition to the discussion paper, we have also developed a checklist, which is an expansion to the NDCs V1 framework of WWF. And in that context, I'm sorry, for some reason it's not changing. Can we please come to the last slide? Okay. Yeah. So we have developed an NDC checklist for just energy transitions, telling us about what should be the essential elements that we need to see within the NDCs. Of course, to ensure mitigation aligned with 1.5-degree goals, we have to set clear and rapid pathways, and we should also have labor rights, implement active labor policies for reskilling and upskilling to ensure adaptation of the workforce. And on the other hand, for finance, we first start with ending the fossil fuel subsidies to basically ensure that no more harm. And fostering systemic change is also key, so countries should invest in green businesses and create jobs, reduce fossil fuel dependencies to basically ensure the economic diversification. And inclusiveness and participation is also another key element that we see, and contribution to sustainable development, and measuring, reporting, and verifying. So those are the key elements that we see in terms of integrating just energy transition to NDCs. So let me give word to my next panelist then.
Thanks for that, Tanyeli. Can hear myself twice, that's weird. Thank you for that, Tanyeli. So I think that's interesting context there of the discussion that we're putting out on just transformation, and also the expectation on governments and the processes and what we'd like to see the development of NDCs in the context of just transformation. What I would turn to now is looking at a slightly different actor. If we look from the private sector perspective, I think this is something, Joachim, that you can maybe speak to in terms of the role of private sector in the context of just transformation. You know, I can't see you, but I'm presuming that you can hear me. So how are businesses currently performing on just transition planning? And what additional signals do you think businesses need to develop a comprehensive approach, and maybe also where we can make the linkages between what businesses are doing on just transformation, just transition, and what the NDC contains. So hopefully you're there.
I'm I'm here.
Great.
Thank you, Truth. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yep, we can hear you well.
Great. Thank you. So, just a bit of a background to WBA, the World Benchmarking Alliance. From our side, we really look at how 2,000 of the world's companies are aligning with the SDGs. We have different methodologies and benchmarks. I'm working in the climate team, and in that team, we will have completed by the end of the year an assessment of 450 high-emitting companies in different sectors, including our latest benchmark for the automotive and transport manufacturers benchmark. And we look both at how they're transitioning credibly in terms of climate, so how they're aligning with 1.5 pathway using the IA's net zero pathway, and also how they're supporting a just transition. So to answer your question, I think there's two elements here, and I'll describe also a little bit what we see from our insights on the just transition side. The first one, I think, is understanding what actually drives a credible just transition plan at a company level. What are the sort of, as you said, signals, policies, or drivers that will push companies to do that? And then the other point, I think, is also how that relates to finance that's deeply needed, specifically how companies raise funds and where those funds are going and how they can be channeled in regions that will face higher social impacts. So maybe taking a step back, just as a bit of a background to our just transition work, we developed back in 2021, co-developed with the ILO, ITUC, IHRB, and other experts, a just transition methodology. That methodology essentially has 6 indicators that are looking at how companies are planning for the just transition. So whether they are anticipating the types of social impacts that might occur, say for their suppliers, their business relationships, how they're engaging in social dialogue, which is a critical component of a just transition, whether they're disclosing the types of social dialogue mechanisms they have and how they're engaging with unions and other affected stakeholders, and also other indicators and metrics, for example, thinking about how inclusive the green jobs are, because in some cases, green jobs will not be accessible, say, to groups that are maybe excluded from the labor market, or women, there's a gender imbalance, as we know, and so on. And so without going into all the details, the idea was to kind of capture different aspects and the breadth of what just transition means. Now we're scaling our just transition assessments to the 2,000 companies, so I can't tell you more about that just now because there will be a methodology draft, and we're consulting with some stakeholders, the ILO and others. But what I can say from the data we have and the insights we have at the moment is that it's interesting. I think we see that there are efforts by companies specifically on green job creation. So at least partially, companies do have some form of green job creation strategy. There's also a number of good practices. They're a little bit scattered across the sectors. I think electric utility sector is the one where the transition is most mature. We see better practice from companies, but we do find, for example, that companies are they have green transformation plans in some cases in regions that will be affected, which I think is particularly important because we know that green jobs will not necessarily be created in the same regions that will face some of the impacts from the transition. That's the case, say, for example, in India, in the US, and elsewhere. So that's why it's particularly important to think about the place-based dimension of just transition. So there are companies that are thinking about that, that are conducting skills gap analysis, thinking about the employment dislocation risks. There's some other interesting practices. They're a bit more niche, or not something we see from all companies, but some do have, for example, what we could call a social investment framework. So they will think about how their broader investments, capex, will align with some of the principles of a just transition. Or, for example, they will have citizen dialogue platforms or ways to engage with communities, consumers, and so on. So, yeah, there are a number of good practices, I think. I would say one of the main gaps, well, there are a lot of gaps, but one of the gaps probably is on the planning side. And there's a couple elements to highlight here. So, first of all, in terms of planning, that means that most companies don't really have a sort of vision or strategy of how they're going to conduct their just transition. So, as I was saying earlier, that means that they don't really have strategies in place to protect or assess which stakeholders might be affected in this process. Potentially another area I think that's really important to highlight is the linkage between climate and just transition. There are companies that have published a just transition strategy, which is interesting, which mentions business engagement with unions and other aspects, but it's kind of disconnected from their broader decarbonization strategy. If we look at their performance in alignment with 1.5, it's not really there yet. So I think it's important to not use this concept of just transition as a way to not transition. So that might be also a risk that can happen for some companies. And yeah, and I would say also it's really important to understand what drives a credible just transition plan. So to that end, we also launched our own just transition working group with about 15 experts from different organizations. And the point was to think about how these company just transition plans fit in a broader international, national, sectoral context. Internationally, this is important because assets that companies have will span across different borders, different jurisdictions. So, for example, there's been a rise in just transition litigation. So it's possible that companies maybe protect well their workforce for some of the production facilities or some of their assets in the main markets, or in markets where there's more public scrutiny, but not so much maybe in other jurisdictions. And also, it's important to think about that in the context of the impact that low carbon transitions will have on local communities, or in terms of how renewable energy projects are being developed. So, for example, there's some excellent work done by the Business and Human Rights Research Center looking at what are the impacts that may happen, for example, in terms of indigenous peoples and local communities. Um, and also, so as part of this working group, we've done different pieces of work, and we're wrapping up a report we will launch early next year in terms of final recommendations. But there's a couple things that come out of the learnings. One of them is that there are, of course, sector specificities to just transition that are worth mentioning. Um, Our methodology at the moment is more sector agnostic, so it's basically applying these 6 indicators I mentioned, using public information we have at hand and looking how the companies are applying it, but we don't yet have sort of a sectoral lens. So while we're not going necessarily in that direction, we did do some work with the KCI, ISD, and GIZ that looked at um, how different studies or modeling or what is the literature basically telling us in terms of what are the sector-specific impacts of just transition. One of the learnings is that there's been a lot of focus on coal phase out, which is important, but not so much in other sectors. Another of the learnings is that there's been a lot of focus on job destruction and creation, but maybe not as much on job quality, which we know is also very important given that the wages will differ, say, for an oil and gas worker that may be well paid versus, in some cases, unfortunately, there may be sort of a subcontracting or renewable energy companies will not have the same types of benefits. So it's really important that we ensure that that transition is just. Yeah, the social impacts more broadly will be quite different. Whether we think about regional economic impacts because of coal and the regional dimension of that, to impacts on the revenues for governments that are more dependent on gas, to the broader value chain and say for automotive companies how that might impact different suppliers and SMEs. And so, yeah, I think that that's an important dimension to keep in mind. And then 2 other learnings from this working group linked to work we've done. One of them, as you were saying, Shirley, is about the role of policy and how it can act both as a sort of carrot and stick and incentivize and regulate companies to really implement these just transition plans. I think at a high level, the just transition integration in NDC and LTS is extremely important, focusing on jobs, social protection, also economic diversification. But it's also important that this is then integrated in a set of national policies that will better incentivize businesses to implement this concretely. So so maybe one statistic that's interesting. It's not necessarily on the just transition per se, but more on human rights. But it is telling in the context that there's less just transition laws than say human right laws. But we see that companies that are based in countries with human rights and environmental due diligence legislation. So, for example, we think of the EU or other countries. The companies tend to perform 60% better in those countries than in countries where there's no such legislation on the human rights aspect. So that shows the power, I think, of regulation in pushing companies to perform better. On a just transition, there are a number of maybe interesting policies we can refer to. So, for example, the UK Transition Plan Task Force, while it's more guidance, it did release some guidance on how the maximization of social opportunities and risks for workers, for local communities, for suppliers was integrated in different climate laws and in different voluntary mandatory frameworks. And so that's interesting because actually companies directly respond to this guidance, but also ideally it should be more mandatory. At the moment, you have the EU standards and other standards elsewhere. There's no specific mandate for companies to report a just transition plan, but indirectly that they do have to report on a transition plan. So better making that link between again climate and social in standards, I think, is really important. And more maybe more indirect but still relevant, there's a number of countries that have started to use fiscal policy, procurement, and other means of basically having preferential loans or conditioning access to public markets to companies or renewable energy developers that will respect a number of just transition fundamentals and reskill, retrain, say, coal workers, or ensure that they contract local suppliers and that they're not just fronting suppliers, but that they're actually engaging in a long-term relationship with them. So whether that's in Spain, the US, there's the Philippine Green Jobs Act. So there's a number of these examples that are starting to build up, and I think, yeah, that can be a real kind of momentum for not just a coalition on NDCs, but more broadly to mainstream the integration of just transition in policy and better condition access to subsidies, to funds, to companies that are showing really tangible steps they're making on just transition. And then, of course, as Tanyeli said, I think the local context matters tremendously. So that's not something we have yet delved deeper into, but we are planning to do so with the finalization of our working group. I think a couple points here that are worth flagging. We tend to see that companies that are more vertically integrated, so that are more controlling different elements in the supply chain, will engage more with their suppliers. I think that, yeah, we need to see this on a case-by-case basis, but it's important, again, to not for companies not to push the burden to SMEs or suppliers down their value chain, but really engage with them so that they actually understand what a just transition is, how can they implement it, what impacts they will face. And then, of course, the estimates of the cost of a just transition and what will be the broader economic impacts will vary. So I think here there's sort of higher level estimates from the high level expert group on climate finance and others on what a just transition cost might be, but more bottom up approaches are also emerging. So that can also be interesting in the context of businesses and understanding how much they need to contribute to this as well. And then maybe just wrapping up, I would say we've done some work for the Brazilian G20 presidency, the Sustainable Finance Working Group. And one of the things that, one of the recommendations that we have in this paper is that credible, robust, and just transition plans can be a key tool to basically design just transition related financial instruments. So in the way companies will raise funds, these plans can condition how much of those funds actually will be used to, for example, go in regions that are facing higher unemployment or contract local suppliers. There's an example from EDF, the French energy utility, but also other examples from SSE, which is also interesting because there's a commission in the context of SSE at a more national level. So I think these plans are also a means of really designing these financial instruments, mainstreaming this in different types of bonds or loans, different types of financial instruments that can then really fund the transition and ensuring that the money is going in the regions that are facing the higher social impacts. And so I think in that context, it's interesting to see also some of the developments from the ADB, the Just Transition Financing Facility, but also what's happening at a country level, say in Colombia with its country platform, and how that's also linked to the importance of transitioning away from fossil fuels in a just way. So I think while not all of these funding mechanisms are directly targeting companies, but they're targeting projects and a number of things where the companies will at one point or another have to play a role. So thinking about, again, how the companies will play that role, ensuring that the funds that they are receiving or that they're being channeled is going to the right regions facing higher social impacts is particularly important. Thank you.
Thanks, Joachim. Wow, there was a lot in there. I hope everybody took good notes. A lot of great examples in there as well. What I quite liked is you sort of started talking about channeling funds and sort of ended up there as well, talking about some really great examples. And I think that's so pertinent in kind of like how we are investing in the just transition, where we are investing, which I think is really great. And I think you also kind of led into some of the next steps for creating the link between the government planning and the private sector planning around looking at some of these key examples and guiding some of the governance on the ground. And I think that's really the way that we want to sort of move this dialogue forward. So I'd be really happy to take any questions on that. One of the things I also picked up was talking about the quality of jobs, not just the quantity of jobs, which is a really wonderful segue to Mustafa from the ILO. Would be great to sort of, unpack the just transition from a labor perspective and talk about it a little bit from this idea of decent work and green jobs. So, how do you think that the just transition, within the NDCs can really prompt this, decent work, movement to more decent work and greener jobs?
Thanks a lot, Shuri. I hope you can hear me well. Yes, first of all, I want to appreciate the very important work the WWF is doing on framing a just transition in the context of energy and the important initiative of the World Benchmarking Alliance. We've been working together also several years back on those first indicators for the private sector. So I want to be brief so that we have time for interaction, but just speak to 2 points. The first one is on the narrative on just transition, because I think that as we speak to the concept of just transition, it's important that we all have more or less a common understanding of what it means. And to do that, I want that we go back to the framing of this notion, which is anchored in the Paris Agreement on climate change. The Paris Agreement speaks to the just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent jobs and quality jobs and decent work. So based on that, the work we've done in the ILO has been first on understanding the nature and scale of changes that could happen in labor markets and the economy in general as we decarbonize. And the story is now very straightforward. There is going to be a massive opportunity for more and better jobs in a decarbonized economy. Our assessment gives us 100 million jobs possible by 2030. And if you look at the energy sector only, through renewable energy deployment, improvement in energy efficiency, and a larger deployment of electric vehicles, we could have 24 million jobs through the Paris Agreement alone. The same data you can see from the International Energy Agency. Now, the other side of it is that not everyone is going to be a winner. In the IEA assessment, we find that 12 million jobs would be lost in the fossil fuel industry in the coming decades. So the story is that there is going to be employment and economic gains on one hand, but there is going to be unavoidable damage. Now, just transition means how do we make sure that we maximize those opportunities for income growth, job creation, and economic development on one hand, while minimizing, if not avoiding, the negative effects of climate change itself and climate response policies. Now, I also want to speak to an important point, which is why in this NDC 3.0 it is absolutely critical to reflect in a very meaningful way the notion of just transition. And for that, I ask you to think about 10 years back. I myself used to be at the UN Environment Program. I've transferred to the ILO about 10 years ago. But when I moved to the ILO, that's where I started to go back to my friends at UNEP and in WWF as well, to think of the social dimensions of climate action. But first of all, there was a sort of rejection, a sort of an anxiety that the climate agenda was already complex. Countries had to mitigate, they had to adapt, they had to build technologies, and they had to finance. Now, if you want to add another layer of it on labor and social policies, you're actually bringing more complication than solution. Then down the road, we started to understand, and data showed it, that if you actually mitigate, you take measures to reduce carbon emissions, you do measures on adaptation, it can actually lead you to more employment creation. And that's the notion of core benefits. But the narrative was still that the core business is mitigate, adapt to climate change, access technology, seek financing, and at the end of the pipe, eventually you get core benefits, job creation, and health improvements. Now, there's a fundamental shift in that narrative, which came with the sixth assessment report of the IPCC of last year. So if you see the AR6, it says that social justice, just transition, decent work, these are enablers of mitigation and adaptation ambition. Now, what it means is that the issues that we are talking about here, they're no longer at the end of the process, they are up front. And this is very clear. We find, for example, that if we want to go to a net zero economy through energy decarbonization and a circular economy, 78 million workers will require reskilling and upskilling. So I live in the Switzerland part next to France, and some of you may know that the French government has a subsidized program on heat pumps. Like house owners can actually shift their energy systems to heat pumps, which is more efficient. But I know people who have subscribed to this program, but they need to wait for months before somebody can come and install your heat pumps. Why is it so? Because we don't have enough technicians. We need to have more electricians, more plumbers retrained to be able to install heat pumps. So that deficit of the workforce is there, and you can talk about it in every sector, in the automotive sector, in the transport sector. And that's why the IPCC is bringing that narrative that the social dimensions, the human capacity, is an enabler. Because if you don't have it, It doesn't matter that in the negotiations here or in the NDCs, countries say, I want to achieve 50% of energy efficiency by 2030. If you don't have enough technicians, energy auditors, engineers to make your energy and efficiency happen, it's not going to happen. It's going to be the same in the transport sector. We want to have green hydrogen. We want to shift use of fuels in bunker and tankers and bunker fuels. But if you don't train the workers and the seafarers to use ammonia, to use green hydrogen, it's not going to be possible because they need to acquire those new skills. So therefore, the narrative has changed, and I think it makes it a very powerful point for the NDCs 3.4, 3.0 to embed those efforts. So there has been some work done in the last round, but it's very limited. And we now have the means of action. I think the elements we've seen in your framing, we have the same in the ILO in terms of the policies on social security. The ILO Global Report on Social Protection of this year, which was launched in the General Assembly this year, comes with many, many of the tools. And I just want to end by saying that if you look at the countries that are going to be the most vulnerable to climate change, the 20 most vulnerable countries, the CVF countries, only less than 9% of their populations have access to any social security. So which means that you need to build social security in your NDC, link it with your climate mitigation and adaptation. So these are some elements of thought, but I think that the very critical point is that the IPCC has made a significant shift in the narrative that social policy, labor policies, they're no more at the end of the pipe. They're not just co-benefits, but they are upfront. If you don't have them built in the NDCs, we won't have the enablers for the ambitions that we need for 1.5.
Thank you, Mustafa. And I just want to say I really appreciate the way that you framed that. I followed the publication of the sixth assessment report myself and was really struck by the fact that the IPCC was really trying to communicate this, that this has to be people-led. It's the only way it's going to happen, and it is the way it's going to happen. You know, we need to sort of be leading from a social perspective, and that's how we will get that transition, and that is a really important tipping point. So I think that was really helpful to raise that. So this is the end of our speakers segment, but I can see some people in the room, and I would be very welcome for some challenging questions. So we can pause a little bit, and if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. We have the panelists here. Joachim, we can't see him, but he's still there. So if you want to talk about the private sector, please do ask.
Thank you, and thanks so much for the informative presentation. My name's Tom, I'm from Australia, very happy to be here. I know a lot of the focus has been on just transition in the energy space, but obviously we're seeing another movement as well alongside that, which is the nature positive movement. And I was just wondering whether any of the panelists had any thought or done any work, I guess, in the just transition within that space, whether there's any takeaways we can take from the energy transition as well.
I can, thank you for the question. I can ask Mustafa, maybe Joachim, I don't know if you want to say anything. You were talking about the sort of sector-specific aspects. I'll pass over. I will say I think that's another one which is so sector-specific. It's a really interesting question, and we really need to be looking at that now when we want this to be people-led across sectors. So it's a really important question.
Yeah, just quickly, I think that's a very relevant question. There's a lot of focus on energy, but we know that agriculture, food systems are going to be significantly impacted, the fishery sector, the tourism industry. So 3 years ago, the ILO, the Inter-American Development Bank, together did a report on low carbon development in Latin America and the Caribbean. What we find in that study is that in that region, decarbonization in the energy sector will be painful. We estimated about 7 million jobs to be lost. But the interesting part is that the opportunity for the region is on the bioeconomy and the forest economy. So we've estimated that if the shift in consumption patterns that we see now with people wanting to eat plant-based proteins, so that we shift away from animal-based protein to plant-based proteins, that could generate 15 million jobs in Latin America and the Caribbean with that development. And so it triggered a lot of interest. We've been asked by FAIR and the Kohler Foundation to do a similar global assessment. So as I speak, the ILO is working with FAO. We're also pulling in the World Bank to carry a global assessment of just transition in agriculture and food systems. And I want to just say, on the tourism sector, I am co-chairing the KCI at the moment for Annex 1 countries. And one of the studies that we've done on the KCI is look at the socioeconomic impact in the tourism sector. We've done a study on Maldives, where their challenge is the massive disruption that it will have on their tourism industry. So any measures that are taken in Europe or elsewhere that will make travel more expensive will impact directly on their revenues as extraterritorial impacts. So these are many other areas, but I'm happy to exchange more bilaterally in terms of what we do.
And Joachim, do you want to come in with anything on this?
So we haven't looked at the agriculture sector specifically, but maybe just flagging, we have done a report in the past, actually before I joined WBA, with GIZ and ISD that did look at just transition in the agricultural sector. It touched on some of the points that Mustafa is mentioning, but also how to support farmers in shifting their cultivation or agricultural practices, integrated farming, and for example, rice fish farming, and how that would support in some cases the better incomes and livelihoods of farmers. There's also a gender dimension to this, and it's quite context specific. So yeah, I can share the link as well. But I think, yeah, one of the things that came about is, I think it was in Bangladesh, if I'm not mistaken, how the shift from mango cultivation, or rice cultivation, sorry, to mango cultivation wasn't always that straightforward. And so understanding how people can make that shift, what are the sort of subsidies or ways to enable them to transition to integrated farming or other types of farming is really important. So yeah, not much at the WBA side at the moment that we've done on this, but there are other studies that we can point to.
Thanks, Joachim. And I will very cheekily sort of do a bit of advertisement of some of the other things that we've got going on NDCs. So like I said, we work on energy, nature, and food systems. We have a few which might be of interest, but for example, we have an NDC partnership event, at the NDC Partnership Pavilion on the 21st, which we're talking about agricultural and food systems in the context of NDCs. So I would expect us to have some discussions around there. So please do join if you have availability there. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Vincent Virda from the UN Capital Development Fund. I'm also going to do a plug because this was asked by Dean Cooper, who's your colleague at the global level for energy, and he asked me to announce here that the Alliance for Just Energy Transformation will have an informal meeting to discuss also what the Alliance is going to be doing over the next year or so. And that event will be held on the 18th of November at 1500 hours at the Global Renewables Hub. So if any of you are interested in joining that, please do come along. Thanks.
I sort of asked for that, but thank you very much. Please do come and support. So we've almost come to the end. I do think we maybe have time for one more question, so I'm just gonna, yeah.
Elchin Sardarov, WWF Azerbaijan Communication Coordinator, COP29. Thank you very much for your very interesting and useful information. My question will, in preparation of NDCs, how you think about role of communities and how you think environmental journalists, how can help in rising awareness of society and active response of people in participation in preparation of NDCs, and also about more focused social impacts of climate change in preparation of NDCs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a great question, I think, going back to the positive narrative. Tanili, do you want to go first? And maybe we can have sort of this as a final reflections from the panelists. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Indeed, that's an excellent question, because we were talking about, while I was telling that why just energy transition should be a part of NDCs, one of the reasons that I've mentioned was actually ensuring that they gain support from the community, right? From those people who are actually on the ground. So that goes same. That the same goes for the NDCs, because NDCs, as the main plans, as the major commitments of the governments to basically mobilize the change that we need. So they have to be prepared in an inclusive way as much as possible. And when we are talking about the local communities, who are one of the main stakeholders who will be directly impacted, especially those in the those living in the fossil fuel energy economy regions, they will be the ones who are mostly affected. So it is very important to make their voice heard, and it is so therefore the NDCs must also elaborate on how to bring on the effective, inclusive and democratic governance mechanisms in this context. And to be able to ensure that kind of inclusive and effective governance, to be able to ensure the effective participation of the local communities, you also have to enable them to be able to participate. You have to also make sure that they have access to relevant information, to make sure that they actually make informed decisions and informed contributions. And in that context, the role of environmental journalists are very, very critical.
Well, thank you. That's a very important question, and I think that's why social dialogue and stakeholder engagement is very going to be very critical. But I want to take this opportunity also to just share a reflection in terms of, how we see the agenda possibly go forward in terms of the energy sector. So in the engagement we have with different countries, I've come myself to the realization that we have 3 buckets of countries that we need to engage with in the NDCs on the energy sector. There are a group of countries which have made a very clear political commitment to decarbonize. They want to move away from oil, gas, and coal to clean energy. So the challenge there is, how do you make that possible economically, transform the workforce, retrain? So you can put South Africa in that bucket. What we do in Mpumalanga and other regions is part of that agenda. But there is a second group of countries which are making it very clear that fossil fuels are so central to their economies that decarbonization is not for today. They need to rely on oil and gas for some time to come. And their agenda is how to make oil and gas less carbon emitting. So that's why carbon capture and carbon storage, things like that, are on their agenda. So the challenge for the workforce is, how do you train workers to be more efficient in oil and gas exploration? But that's that reality. Now we have a third bucket of countries, which are countries, while the IPC says that we need to get out of fossil fuels by the end of this century, they are actually becoming new players in oil and gas. You can see that in West Africa. I'm originally from Senegal. Senegal is going to be becoming, just this year, a net energy importer to a net energy exporter. Is one of the more important natural gas reserves in Africa. And you have that in Guyana and other countries. So the challenge is, there is a developmental debate as well, this notion whether one calls it right to development or whatever they want to call it. But we as a decarbonization community, how can we work with those countries to make sure that they take advantage of their natural resources, but avoid a carbon lock-in effect, that they lock in their economies in fossil fuels for decades to come, which we can't afford. So how can you help them build a workforce in oil and gas, because that's what they are wanting to do now, but make it possible for a transition to clean energy of that workforce to be possible. So therefore, we have this reality that countries are not in the same context. We have the same direction of travel, but the pace is not going to be the same. And I think it will be important that our tools and approaches be aligned with that reality.
Thank you again, and a really clear message on why NDCs are so important this time, especially. Joachim, you have the final word. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and I'll be brief because I know we're out of time. I'll just keep it to one statement to say I think it's really important to think of transition planning as a sort of mirror process, what's happening at an NDC level, at a national level, but also look at how that's being done at a company level. Because if it's only sort of in the NDC, but it's not being operationalized on the ground by companies, then there's a serious problem. Same thing as for climate, having a commitment or ambition gap and how that's going to be actually implemented. So there's a lot of resources and things we know how to do them right, from revenue sharing models, consulting local communities, social dialogue, everything that's been mentioned in this panel. So I think we really need to create that mirror process between what's happening in NDC, national planning, and also that companies play their fair part and actually deliver on the outcomes that we want them to deliver on.
Thanks very much, Joachim. Thanks everybody for attending. This is part of an ongoing piece of work we're doing on the Just Energy transformation with everybody here. And so if you'd like to speak to us about it, maybe partner, please do come and engage. We're very excited about the piece of work, and otherwise hope to see you soon in our next event. Thank you.